Hi, I'd like to talk to you today about Moog's 960 analog sequencer module. It's an interesting module based on Buchler's 123 sequencer and in turn Roland's 182 sequencers based on it, which we'll get into all of that later. But first let's build up a patch from scratch using this. I like to do patches from scratches. So this lead is just going into the door here, so this is what you're going to be hearing. So let's plug that into the VCA first of all. So the VCA just makes things quieter and louder, and for example we can plug in this here oscillator, not playing any particular note. We can plug that into this VCA and then we can change the volume of it. So that's, making any sound. The oscillators never stop. So let's hook up, let's see, first of all we want to output whenever the sequential controller does anything, whenever it increments its step, let's output that, let's see, oscillator output into the V-trig input on this here interface. Most of the Moog modular uses something called S-trig, which means usually there's a voltage that's a certain number, and when you press a key on the keyboard to make a note, that dips down to no volts, and you let go and it goes back up again. Whereas most other things are the opposite. They're by default not outputting anything, no voltage, and when you press a key it jumps up for the duration of the note and back down again. So this does it the new way, this does it the old way, and so this kind of gets them to talk to each other by converting the two signals back and forth. So whenever this increments a step it momentarily goes high, but this envelope generator, ADSR envelope generator on the Moog needs it to go low, so we're converting it from one to the other. And because Moog's modular synthesizers are very old, from the 1960s, they pretty much predate LEDs being a thing, so there's no way of knowing when it's playing a note really. With the actual synthesizer part, you wouldn't even know if it's turned on until you've wired up enough of a patch to hear something. It's only the sequencer and its switch that really has any kind of an indication that it's doing something. Or even turned on, and even then those were, I'm not sure exactly what kind of lights they were, they called them lamps, but it predates LEDs anyway, predates LEDs being popular anyway. So let's hook up that output to the VCA, so it should make a note. Let's listen to the oscillator again. It's still not doing any particular pitch, but we should hear it one note per step, which would be rather nice to hear. So ADSR envelope generator controls the CV of the amplifier. The oscillator is what we hear as the signal going into it. Let's try that. Hey, it works. So we can change how long the note lasts with the envelope generator. Well, not how long it lasts, but how long it takes to fade out. Okay, so let's use this to send pitches to the oscillator. So this has 3 different rows of control voltages, and you can use any of them for anything you want. Most common use is as a pitch. So we can take the pitch out of the first row here and pop it into the oscillator controller here. And then we can take the output of that and daisy chain that to here. There we go. Now the first thing you might notice is these are just very, very random pitches. They're not 12-tone equal temperament, they're just really completely analog, loosey-goosey pitches that can be absolutely anything. So the one non-bow one non-Moog inspired, non-Moog module I've got is this one here. This is a quantizer which takes these analog signals, basically that we're going to be using for pitches, and it changes it from being absolutely any value whatsoever to being one of a certain note. So it's a subset of those. So instead of just being, say, you know, C sharp and a half, it will say actually it's closer to C sharp or it's closer to D. That's what it's going to be. These are now notes, so we can just enter some notes now. And the nice thing about this quantizer is you can say I want it to be in this particular key. So this is a minor scale. We could do a major scale. Or quint, I assume is pentatonic, I'm not sure. Or we can do a chord instead of a whole scale. The quint one sounds nice, the one I assume is pentatonic, so let's try that. Also, another feature is you can transpose it, which if you've got a keyboard hooked up, you could just play the root note on the keyboard and everything will be relative to that. I don't have a keyboard hooked up here, you won't be able to see it the way I've got things set up, but I can take, for instance, here's 6 volts in this control panel here. The attenuator's control panel is, let's turn that off again. The attenuator's control panel is a pretty interesting way this works, because there's no real standard back then. These days, things like your filters and your amplifiers, they have multiple inputs and each one has an attenuator to say how strongly that affects it. So you can say, well, the pitch of the note should slightly affect the filter's position, but in addition to that, the envelope generator should really affect the filter's position, and the knobs are always on the thing they're going into. Whereas Moog's the opposite. You put in, say, a pitch or a what else can you put in? An envelope from the envelope generator, and then you can attenuate it at different amounts. That same signal going into different modules. So that's an interesting kind of way he did it. There were no standards back then, they were still inventing them. So they didn't know what was going to take off and what wasn't. So this outputs plus 6 volts, that's minus 6. So we've got 6 volts here, but this is then attenuated, and you can change how much it's attenuated by. And that would change the amounts that the notes are transposed by. So that's the transposing there. Sorry that I keep blocking the view with trying to not make this wobble around too much. So that's the original one, but if we change the dial here, we can change which key it's in. I don't necessarily want to do that right now, but you know, it's nice to know that's how that works. Let's see, okay, so I like to build up my patches a bit though, so let's make this sound a little bit meatier. Instead of listening to one oscillator, let's listen to all 3. So we'll take the output of the mixer here, that's going into the VCA now, and we can daisy chain this see the pitch going from one oscillator to the next. It's going out of that one into that one. Now this is a much smaller clone than the real thing, and it has a few other differences. With the original Moog modular, it had a lot of internal routing that I think most people don't know about. So I believe, say for example, you plug in the pitch to here and it would automatically be passed along from the oscillator controller to the 3 actual oscillators. You don't need to hook them up around the front, it does it around the back automatically. And similarly, the envelope generators, they all get routed internally. So this particular clone doesn't do that, but I think it's kind of clearer to demonstrate what it is that's happening if it happens to work this way anyway, so you can actually see what's happening instead of having to look it up somewhere. Actually, let's use a smaller cable for that. Okay, so let's connect the first oscillator back again, because that clicking is just the sound of nothing getting louder and quieter. And it's back. And we can add the second oscillator as well. That's flattened it up a bit. And the third oscillator. Actually, longer cable. Now we're getting somewhere with a Moog sound. But instead of connecting it directly to the VCA, let's first go through the best module that Moog ever made, the low pass filter. Generally the best, most fun module on any synth, I think, filling with the cutoff point on the filter. This one I've had modded, so it's like the earlier 1967 version, even though this particular clone, whose brand I will not name, went for later style. Like with the oscillators, they're all 921s instead of 901s. But this filter I've had modded, so it really is like a 904A, the first kind. That's nice already. Bit of resonance, or regeneration as it calls it. Because it was the 60s and everyone spoke like Doctor Who. Okay, so I just, for a bit more flavour, I will take this other envelope generator, we'll trigger that as well. So we'll trigger both of them, so this can go into multiples. So at least has multiples. Connect that. The output of the LFO built into the sequencer into that envelope generator, and also this other one. Now I can use this other envelope generator to affect the filter directly, but that's a bit too much affecting it for my liking. So with a long enough patch cable, I'm going to route that to another attenuator. It's a bit closer to what we want, and then route that attenuator finally into the filter, so we can affect it not at all with the second envelope generator, or quite a bit, or just a little bit. Okay, so that's a nice patch built up. Now we can get back to the sequencer and what that does. So this is an 8-step sequencer. It can play up to 8 notes, much like the Buchla 123 that it's based on, that can play up to 8 notes. But the way this does less than 8 is a little bit kind of weird and interesting. You can tell it to stop on any note, and it will just get stuck there until you tell it to let go again. And you can also skip any note. So those two won't play anymore. Now personally, I think that's a little bit possibly over engineering there. I'm not entirely clear on why you would want to specify which notes you want to skip, rather than just saying here's the length, it's just going to be the first ones, which is what everyone else did before and since. But okay, fine, it's nice to have options. Also, it can do a one shot like this. If you set it to stop after it's finished all 8 notes, you get this. So it just plays it all the way through once and then stops rather politely. Now, let's change that back. Okay, now the reason that you might want to do that is that you can use these sequencers for anything. especially the old analog ones, which they don't really contain much in the way of, they're not using computers or processing power. This one might be because it's a clone. But in general, the originals, they don't do that. So they can go really fast. They can get up to audio rates. So instead of sending out a pitch to an oscillator, you can, say, use an oscillator's pulse wave to clock it. And then the sequencer is the oscillator. And you can just change the waveform by having 8 steps that you can set to any amount, for instance. Or if you want to use it as an LFO, you slide it back down to LFO speeds and you just set it to 8 different values. Now it's an LFO. It'll be a bit clicky as it goes directly from each step to the next. You can hear the stepping as it's known, which is what audiophiles tend to think CD players have, but they don't, because you can use a slew limiter to then even out and smooth the transition from one to the other by slowing down how quickly it can get from one to the next. So instead of like a high up step and bam, lower step, it'll be like, oh, I've got to go down now, but I do it slowly, like that. And that's how things like CD players work, because they slew it, which is basically the exact same thing as a low-pass filter, only at a much slower speed. And not only will that make the transition smoother, it actually, in the case of samplers and CDs and everything, gives you exactly what you originally put back into it. The way that trick works is it has a low-pass filter going in as well. So anything that it wouldn't be able to keep up with is not going to be represented there at all. And so with the filter going out, you get exactly what you put into it with no stepping at all. But a lot of audiophiles don't seem to understand that, but there you go. That's how that works. Anyway, this is not exactly like a CD because it's only got 8 samples and those samples are analog. But still, it's the same kind of principle. So where were we? Playing 8 notes, excellent. I would also like to control the filter cutoff point even more, because I love controlling the filter cutoff point. So let's grab a few more cables. And take, say, the 3rd row, row C here, and send that to the filter as well. That's nice, I like that. So again, these don't need to be pitches, you can control anything with them. Now, if you wanted to, you could say control pitches with all 3 and kind of sort of brute force engineer the synthesizer into being a bit like it's polyphonic when it's not, but really that's kind of defeating the point. I mean, there are much better instruments if you want polyphony, such as a string machine or a mellotron. So anyway, keeping it monophonic, you can control other things with it. But there's more. Now, it's only playing up to 8 notes, and it's outputting 3 voltages for each of those 8 steps. But we've got this thing here, which I think is actually the main contribution that Bob Moog did here. I'm not sure if you can see that. That's the sequential switch. And what that does is combines with the sequencer. What we do with all these outputs here is this outputs a gate whenever it gets to that step. So whenever it gets to the first step, this can send a signal to the switch, telling it to shift its position. So all this does is this pays attention to one of the inputs, and it outputs whichever one it's paying attention to. And whenever it loops back to the beginning, we increment which one it's paying attention to. So instead of putting this directly into the quantizer, we can take the output of the first row, pop that into the signal input here, and then we can output that into the quantizer. Okay, there's no change yet because it's only got one thing connected, but we can take the second row and we can also connect that to the switch. Oh no, that's the thing I done wrong. This should be the output, not the input. There we go. So it's alternating the first row and second row. Now, in terms of the pitch, it's alternating between the first and second rows. So this one's going out to the quantizer, then this one, then this one, then this one. But as it's alternating those, it's still outputting the same 8 steps each and every time. So the cutoff point is not alternating when the pitches are. So it makes for a quite repetitive pattern in a way that I think sounds kind of nice. That's either, you know, limitation or a feature, depending on how you want to look at it. It's an interesting constraint to work within for some music. Another interesting quirky thing Moog did is, because this sequencer has its own built-in LFO, you can connect the third row to the timing input in the LFO, so some notes can be quicker than others, like this. Now, I'm not entirely sure why you'd want to do that. I'm sure if you got the timing just right, you could have some notes be exactly, like, say, twice as fast as others, or like, you know, some other kind of mathematically sensible way that kind of brute forces a complex rhythm in. But that's not the best way to do a complex rhythm. Remember, this doesn't need to use its own internal LFO here. You can trigger it from anything. There's a button here you can manually trigger it. Although that's not outputting the shift, so that's not entirely useful. But you can trigger this from anything. So, for instance, every time you play a note, that could trigger it. So you could be alternating between, like, you know, any number up to 8, say, filter cutoff position, something like that, while you're playing a regular, actual, honest to goodness melody. This even has an audio input, as it did on the original Moog, which means that, say you've got like a click track, or your drummer's playing hi-hats on a different track, you could totally synchronize it to that, and then it'd be, you know, playing a nice little rhythm, and you can get it to do anything in sync to that rhythm, such as, you know, play pitches or do anything else. So it really is quite versatile once you're in the mindset of not just, you know, what it is often used for, but what it can be used for. Because like all modules, it's best done in a modular way where you can hook it up from anything to anything. I might as well show you the full gamut, where we can take that third output. Running out of patches now. We can take the third output, because there's 2 of everything, so you can route it to 2 different places even without a multiples. We can connect the third one also to the switch, and it can automatically detect that you've got a lead plugged in there, and now it will alternate between all 3 instead of just 2. And if you unplug it again, it'll stop doing that. So now it's just going between the first 2 again and not the third anymore. I've unplugged the wrong one. There we go. So yeah, it's pretty nifty. It's for up to 8 or 16 or 24 voltages, which you can use as pitches, but you don't have to. You can use them for other things too. And if you do want to make your own miniature Eurorack clone of a Moog modular and use its sequencer, I really do recommend the dual quantizer, so you don't have to manually tune every single note to actually be bang on the note. I think that's everything I wanted to say, so let's just muck around for a bit. try and do a little bit of Giorgio Moroder style. Anyway, yeah, it's a fun little synthesizer. You know, if you want to make music 60s style. Thank you to my sponsors for you know, sponsoring all this nonsense. It's really nice to kind of, you know, muck around with this stuff for an audience. Hopefully it's kind of informative for anyone who's considering getting any of this stuff or wondering what you can do with it. Yeah, hopefully it's been a bit informative to someone at least. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.